Your truth lights my spirit day by day, day by day. Your wisdom guides each choice I make today. Shows how to save my heart in every way, every way. I'm pursuing truth the rest of my days.
We are coming to the end of the book of Galatians. It's 6 chapters long. We are going to wrap up chapter 5 today. So for the sake of just kind of linearly going through the stuff that we've already talked about and just real quick summary, let's start quick reviewing chapter by chapter. So Galatians chapter 1, Paul makes a statement that's very important to the rest of the book, that he is not of man or from man, but his apostleship or his ministry is through Jesus or Yeshua. Okay, so Paul's entire thing he attributes to God and God alone. Remember, when he has his conversion, he doesn't associate with any of the believers of the time right then. He spends some time alone. We don't know what he's doing, but then he gets into ministry, eventually touches base with the leaders in Jerusalem, and they affirm his ministry and the gospel that he's preaching. He does specify that he is warning the church, this is the purpose of the letter of the churches in Galatia, against a different or a false gospel. Paul's gospel, the one that he preaches, he claims in chapter 1 is from Christ. In other words, again, it has been affirmed by leaders of the church. It's a message that he has received from Christ. It has not been taught to him by anyone. Therefore, it cannot be manipulated or tainted by anyone. Does that make sense? Number 4 here in chapter 1, Paul's testimony and calling. He begins to get into his former life, what it is he's been doing, and kind of his personal story, right, when he starts this letter in Galatians. Chapter 2, Paul discusses false brothers that are being intermingled into the churches of Galatia. These are people who profess to be believers, but they are not bearing the fruit. They are not teaching truth. They are not exhibiting what would be the fruit of an actual believer. He calls them false brothers. Paul resisted these false brothers to guard the gospel and the message that they're bringing, okay? And so this is something that Paul is very purposefully doing, both in person and now that he's writing these letters, in terms of trying to make sure that the gospel that the churches in Galatians are getting is true and untainted by human tradition or man-made regulation, but that they are getting the true knowledge and the true gospel of Christ. Church leaders send Paul and Barnabas out to the Gentiles. So this is, again, something he mentions. This parallels with Acts. If you guys remember, we were looking through Acts and trying to line up these stories so we can get our timeline better and understand what exactly is going on. So they send Paul and Barnabas out with a blessing to go share the gospel with non-believers in Asia, or with Gentiles in Asia. So false gospel, the next one here is the false gospel evident in Antioch, is evident in Antioch due to false separation from Gentiles by Peter. Again, Peter uses it as an example of hypocrisy that has snuck in because of this false gospel and this false teaching and the pressure from these false brothers. The true gospel is justification by faith in Yeshua, okay? But Paul very clearly states this early on in the letter, and he continues to reinforce this point as the letter goes on. Galatians chapter 3. The churches have been bewitched by this false gospel of self-justification. In other words, not putting their faith in Yeshua for justification, but trying to earn or demonstrate that justification by their own actions and their own behavior. Paul begins putting the law or the Torah in its proper place in the life of the believer. This is a really important part of the entire middle of Paul's letter, is getting people to understand the relationship between faith and justification through Yeshua and the practical application of the law in the life of the believer. He never once says that the law is done away with. He never condemns the law. He doesn't do those things in Galatians chapter 3 or anywhere else in this letter. He is specifically trying to get the new believers, both Jew and Gentile, to understand where the law fits in. And it's not for salvation, is it? Okay? All right. They are, so those who rely or depend or are of the law cannot justify themselves because they do not keep it, right? This is something he says in verse 10 in chapter 3. Therefore, as a result of them not keeping it, they are subject to the curse of the law, which is what? Death, right? They are subject to the curse of the law instead of the blessings of the law, which is what? Life, okay? Verse 13, the gospel of Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Again, he summarizes in one sentence the true message of the gospel. The Torah was added because of transgression. This is from verse 19. And it is not contrary to God's promise, right? Remember, Paul does this kind of back and forth, discussing promises and covenants and all these things. He's trying to get them, again, to understand the role of the Torah in their lives, and that it's not in conflict or contrast to the coming promise that God made of Yeshua and justification through faith in Yeshua. And that's verse 21. The Torah, in effect, imprisons the world. Due to sin, it reveals in each person until Yeshua comes. And so Paul uses this in language of being like imprisoned or in captivity, not to the Torah itself, but to sin, because the Torah is exposing their sin, and now they understand, look, I'm a captive to this sin. I need to be freed. The Torah leads us to the Messiah for our freedom, and allows us to better understand its role in our lives as believers. The gospel is that Yeshua sets us free from this imprisonment. So once again, we kind of have the summary from Paul in Galatians chapter 3 of the gospel message. And the law serves as a guardian which leads us to Messiah. We did a few weeks on this, if you guys remember. I'm not going to rehash that again today. Galatians chapter 4. The promise is available for every Jew and Gentile. Paul makes a very specific point to break down this false separation between Gentile and Jew, and to proclaim once again that the true gospel is open to everyone, whether Jew or Gentile. Faith frees us from slavery to the rudimentary teachings or principles or practices of the world. This would include both Jewish traditions and pagan traditions. Remember, his audience is both, right? So it has to apply to both groups. Gentile observances of equally binding and governance to justify oneself before a God of some sorts, including Jewish man-made traditions that they have built up over the years, particularly in the oral Torah. Hagar and Sarah we have in chapter 4. If you guys remember, we talked about this last week. This example of Hagar and Sarah. Hagar, the bondwoman, is representative of the current Jerusalem, governed by the oral Torah and man-made traditions that abuse and misuse the Torah, subjugating its followers to men and ultimately into sin against God. This is the root of the false gospel Paul is warning about as it was now being leveraged against new Gentile converts in these churches. Sarah, then, being the free woman, represents the product of faith in Yeshua, entering the pure kingdom of heaven, where we are justified through Yeshua, who redeemed us from the curse of death. And then we got into the very beginning of chapter 5 last week, if you guys remember. And this is what we talked about. Christ has set us free. Do not submit again to slavery. Slavery being again to sin or our flesh. He gets into this in chapter 5. We're going to talk about this today. Slavery is the path of self-justification via man-made tradition, Torah, etc., including submitting ourselves to any sinful desire we have. So it's just as much slavery and captivity to be in bondage to men and their traditions and teachings and to leave God aside, or to try to justify ourselves because we never will be able to, right? Because none of us perfectly obey God. And finally, if you choose this path of self-justification, you must keep the entire law perfectly. Because if you break it at all, you no longer can justify yourself, right? So any breach of the Torah, any breach of God's instructions then removes you from justification, and you cannot restore that justification. You are from that moment on a sinner. And Paul is trying to remind them then, this is why the gospel is so important, the true gospel of faith and trust in Yeshua. All right, we're all caught up? Okay, so we're going to start with Galatians chapter 5, verse 7. I do want you guys to know, especially you visitors, if you don't like me and the way I delivered, that's okay. There are 3 more guys that teach, and we rotate every week. So you'll get a whole month without me if you want to come back and you can hear other people talk. So if I'm not your cup of tea, it's not going to offend me, that's okay. Go ahead and come back next week and somebody else will talk to you and you might like them better. So that's okay. I just want to let you know just before I start stepping on toes. I do have slides. Reese was trying to show me up last week and then he's not here. I can't pay him back. Okay, so let's get into chapter 5, verse 7. Let's read this first part. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who called you. A little leaven leavens the lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. So let's start with this first part. You were running well. If you read any of Paul's letters, he is constantly referring to these sports metaphors. For most of us today, that's somewhat relatable. He's not talking about football, but running. And in the Greek world, that was more applicable. But fill in the blank with whatever sport you want, and this might make a little bit more sense. But Paul's point here is, and he uses this metaphor constantly, this running metaphor is living out the life of a believer. Okay? And in the most basic summary, that's what he's talking about. So when he's referencing this type of thing, that's the point. That's what he's trying to communicate to his readers. You were running well. In other words, you were walking this life as a believer well. Okay? You had what you needed. You were growing in your faith. You were making progress in this race. Like every race has a start and a finish when you're running. Who here's been a runner? Okay, good. Most of you guys know that then. So you start in one spot and you end, right? You may go around in circles a whole bunch, or you might go someplace else. But yeah, if you've been a runner, you know how this goes, right? You were running well, you were following the path, you were doing well. It doesn't mean you're going to win necessarily, but it means you're going to complete the race. Does that make sense? Okay? Now here's the next thing that Paul says. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? So he takes this running metaphor, and then he has this dropped in there. Who hindered you? This word hinder is really important. In the Greek, in terms of the message that Paul is trying to relay to his readers. This Greek word implies cutting in. Okay? So in Paul's running the race metaphor, someone has cut in on the proper implementation of godly living in the life of believers to the churches of Galatia. So in other words, they were doing well, they were on the course, they were following the right path for their race, and somebody has cut in and derailed their progress or veered them off course. So the implication is you're not running so well anymore, right? So this word hindered is a very active thing. Somebody has come in and disrupted this progress that you've been making. You were doing good. Somebody's cut in. In other words, they had been instructed in the correct understanding and were running the race of their spiritual life or their life as a believer properly. But an outside influence has interrupted their progress, preventing them from successfully progressing in their current course. Okay, this is kind of the point that Paul's making. So this is something Paul alludes to in 2 Timothy 2:5. Let's take a look at this verse really quick. An athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. In other words, if I'm running a race and I don't follow the rules, even if I cross the finish line first, can I win? No. Now, I was a runner, and I didn't do sprints ever. I was slow, so they didn't put me in fast races. So I just ran circles. That's what I did. So one time, they actually put myself and the rest of our long-distance team into the mile relay, so we each ran a 400. That was like getting punched in the face because you can't slow down. I slowed down. That's what I do. Anyway, so we ran the thing, and one of the rules when you started that race was they waterfalled the start. So from lanes 1 to 8, the outer lane, because they had farther to go, started a little farther up the track. And that was waterfalled back to lane 1, who started right on the line. And you would run your laps, and after the very first lap was done, everybody would consolidate down into lane 1, and you would run the rest of the race. Now here's the deal. If you were the first runner, if you took even a shoelace step out of that line, your team was disqualified. You had to stay in your lane, not on it in terms of jumping over the line, stepping on the line. You had to stay in your lane. Period, end of story. And if you didn't, your entire team was disqualified. So there are rules. If you're going to win the race, in this metaphor Paul is using with Timothy, you have to know the rules. So Paul encourages Timothy to earnestly continue in his race with discipline, focus, and an understanding of the guidelines by which that race can be won. In the same way, he desires the churches of Galatia to remember the rules of the race and resist being disqualified because they are being led astray by bad actors or false brothers. You were running well. Who has hindered you? So he's trying to get them to think about this process. There's a right and a wrong way to run this race. Something has thrown you off course. Something has prevented you, and you are at risk of being disqualified. This is kind of the implication of the message, and we'll see more of this as he continues to talk. But does that make sense, everybody? It's kind of a basic metaphor you see with Paul a lot. Okay, so who has hindered you from obeying the truth? What's the question we should ask when we see this word? What is the truth? What is he talking about, right? This is a direct reference to Paul's previous teaching to the churches. Remember, this is not the first time they've heard from him. He's not like, oh, hey, there are a bunch of churches up here in Galatia. I'm going to write them a letter, right? He had been up there. He had ministered there. He stayed with them for a while. This is part of his testimony. So he knows what they know. He knows what's been taught. He knows the leaders and the people that go there. So he's not calling them back to him. In other words, follow me, be my disciple. He is calling them back to what he taught them in accordance with the true gospel and godly living. Does that make sense? So the truth that he's referencing is this truth of Scripture, the true gospel that he is trying to communicate to his believers. So here's a quote this is from Bible Hub, and they have a section called Cultural and Historical Background regarding this particular word. This is Strong's 225. So this is how they address this particular topic. It says this: in the Greco-Roman world, truth was a significant philosophical concept, often associated with reality and the nature of being. Now, the reason why this is important because Paul's up in Asia, right? The Greco world, that was controlled by Greece, right? So when we're trying to figure out what his readers might have understood about what he was saying, we have to look at it through the lens of what a Greco-Roman thinker of the time would have been thinking, right? And that's what they're trying to get us to understand. In the Jewish tradition, truth was closely linked to God's character and his covenant, faithfulness. The New Testament writers, influenced by both Jewish and Hellenistic thought, present truth as an essential attribute of God and a fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. Jesus Christ is depicted as the embodiment of truth, and his teachings are presented as the ultimate revelation of God's truth in humanity. So is Paul calling them back to be like him? No, he's trying to call them back to the truth that they were taught in this lens. Christ is the truth. The words that you have been taught are truth. Don't forget those. That's the well-running that you were doing before. Okay, you have veered off of this truth now, and now we're someplace else. Okay, so the next thing Paul says here in verse 8, this persuasion is not from him who calls you, the him here being God, Yeshua, right? Right? So he's saying, look, what you're being persuaded of now is not from God. That's really a short way to say what he's trying to say here. Effectively, by submitting to these false brothers, the converts in Galatia have fallen away from God or Christ, or accepted these men who are not God as their masters. Remember, Paul's already said all of this in earlier chapters. So now he's kind of wrapping everything up. Okay? So here's another quote from you. This is from this book, The Jewish Roots of Galatians, and this is what they had to say about this section of the verse. This obstruction is a persuasion. Obstruction in terms of their race, right? Somebody's come in and hindered you. This obstruction that Paul is talking about, this hindrance, is a persuasion, something they've been convinced of. Paul suggests here that the Galatians' obedience has turned into dissuasion from the gospel. Their loyalty, in other words, is not to God who called them, but to those who are turning them away from their calling. So by obeying or following the teaching of these false brothers, they have left their servanthood to God and have now put themselves into slavery to men. And we've talked about this almost the entire book that we've been discussing so far, right? So again, Paul's patterns here are being repeated. He's summarizing the points that he's already made. So let's continue here. In verse 9, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. You were running well, somebody's hindered you. They've hindered you because they persuaded you of something that's ungodly. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now, we can probably deduce what Paul's saying here, right? The leaven is what? This persuasion, this thing that's hindering them. And the risk of this little bit of leaven is what? It's spreading. It will eventually leaven the entire lump, right? And once it's in there, it's not easily removed. How many of you bake things? I don't. I'm bad at it. But once you put leaven in bread, you don't just reach in there and grab it back out again, right? That's not how it works. And so Paul is using this metaphor as a way of communicating the difficulty of having accepted this in terms of being able to root it back out again. So this metaphor echoes back to what Yeshua teaches in Luke chapter 12, verse 1. So let's take a look at that verse really quick. Not there. Where did I put it? Maybe I didn't put it there. Anybody have their Bible and they want to read it real quick? You'd have to shout. I don't have it in there. Luke 12:1. Anybody? Luke chapter 12, verse 1. So in this chapter in Luke, Yeshua is talking to the Pharisees. He's correcting them. If you guys remember. All right, Jason, really, really, really loud. 12:1.
Okay, this is the International Standard. It says, meanwhile, the people had gathered by the thousands and were trampling on one another. Yeshua began to speak first to his disciples. Right. Watch out for the yeast.
There you go. Yeah.
That is the hypocrisy of the Pharisees.
Okay, so Yeshua is warning his listeners, watch out for the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. The leaven in Yeshua's teaching is what? Hypocrisy. Even Paul makes reference to the impact of this false gospel, having caused Peter to act hypocritically towards his Gentile brothers in faith in Antioch. Paul is drawing from something that a metaphor Yeshua uses about hypocrisy, false teaching, and now here, even in Paul's letter, he's making reference to the same effect, the same bad fruit from this teaching, hypocrisy, right? And Peter, unfortunately, was led astray in that way earlier in Paul's letter. So Paul corrects Peter for allowing others to cut in on his running the race, and now he is facing a similar challenge in Galatia, Paul with the church there in Galatia. So Paul attempts to communicate how easily and completely false doctrine can integrate into the life of a new believer if it's left unchecked. Now, if you remember, Paul talks about contending for the true gospel earlier. He doesn't give into it. In Acts, when we're talking about Paul, he says, look, we resisted this for hours, and we are not going to let this set in, right? And this is a mission that Paul has regarding the churches, is to avoid these false doctrines leading people astray. It also echoes back to Paul's description of the Torah as a guardian, which keeps the person it's in charge of on the right path, if you think about it in that sense. So Paul's goal, his mission, his thought process here is attempting to lead people the right way, the Torah being the truth, leading people the right way, but then you have this false doctrine entering leaven into the mix and causing problems, right? So let's look at this next verse here. Boom, there we go. Okay, so verse 10, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. Now, this is not the first time so far in this letter Paul's talked about penalties, has he? Punishments for those leading people astray. This is a common thread in many of Paul's letters. This is something he deeply cares about in terms of these people causing such harm to the body of believers. And so, again, this is something you're going to see over and over and over again when it comes to Paul. So let's look at our next chunk of verses here, the chapter 5, so Galatians chapter 5, verses 11 through 13. Let's see what this has to say. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Some of your translations may use a more graphic word there, as we heard earlier. Verse 13, you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. Now, a lot of people think Paul just radically changes pace here, and he goes into kind of like church practices and everybody get along. I think it's all actually related. We'll get into this. But when Paul talks about if I still preach circumcision, what does that mean? What is he saying here? Okay, yes. Leaning on or relying on circumcision for salvation. Paul is not saying he never teaches circumcision or that he teaches against circumcision. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying in the context of this false gospel, if I'm still preaching circumcision, because remember, he was a Pharisee, for your salvation or freedom, or your inclusion in the promise, as a gateway, then why am I still being persecuted? Okay? So there is something important here that I think is that we should take note of. It is possible that Paul is making this particular point because these false brothers are trying to leverage Paul's fame or celebrity to further their false gospel. In other words, they may be in the churches in Galatia, in Paul's absence, telling people that this is what Paul's saying. And so Paul may feel the need to vindicate himself from this charge. This is not what I'm saying. That may be what he's saying here. That's my personal speculation. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us that. But it's possible that people are trying to leverage Paul's celebrity, using him and saying, look, Paul told us to come tell you this, or this is what Paul believes, or this is what Paul's teaching other places. You need to be circumcised before you can be saved. But we know, especially in this letter, Paul has made abundantly clear that that is not what he's teaching. He does not believe that you have to be circumcised to be saved or to be justified before God. Okay? So he's being persecuted, according to this letter. Who is persecuting Paul? He doesn't exactly tell us here, but I want you guys to try to think critically. Who is persecuting Paul? Okay, so Rika said religious zealots. The party of the circumcision, right? The Pharisaical converts that are coming in. These are the people that Paul is constantly butting heads with. There's also the Hellenistic Jews that are constantly, literally following Paul around, just finding ways to stir up strife between him and the Orthodox Jews of his day, many of whom were probably his contemporaries. Now, why? Why then is he being persecuted? So he has moved away from man-made traditions that he taught, that he upheld, that he was a good student of. Remember, he says all this earlier in the letter. He was excelling in these man-made traditions of the Pharisaical sect. These things were built upon the oral tradition that had used the Torah as a foundation, but now had manipulated, had changed things. And this oral tradition, if you guys remember, I offered a quote really early on from the Mishnah that talks about this, how the oral tradition was at least equal in their eyes to the Torah, if not more important, because it was a newer revelation. To them, it was the most important thing. Therefore, they set aside the command and the instruction that God had given them for their own tradition. Remember Yeshua saying this. Paul is dealing with the exact same thing now. Okay? So this is the who and the why, right? So is Paul teaching against the Torah? No. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So he is attempting to teach a true gospel while putting the Torah in its proper place. This is the entire point of the book of Galatians. Understand what salvation or justification is, and then fit the Torah in where it actually belongs, right? They've got the cart before the horse. He's trying to say, look, it actually goes here, right? This is a direct response to the false gospel of self-justification by the misuse or abuse of the Torah being peddled upon the Galatian churches, and this is why he's writing the letter. So let's look at an example, Acts 21, just to kind of delve into this point just a little bit more about who these people are. So Acts chapter 21, verse 27 and 28. So it says this: when the 7 days were almost complete, the Jews from Asia, the Hellenistic Jews, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. This does not mean they prayed for him. Okay? Right? What does it mean to lay hands on? There were likely fisticuffs, okay, as Chris said. Okay? This is what would maybe mildly be said a violent uprising against Paul. Okay? So they stirred up the whole crowd, laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help!" This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law, and this place being the temple. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. So we know who the who is, right? The Hellenistic Jews, the Jews from Asia, the Jews from the Greek-influenced world. And this is the charge against him. This is what Paul is teaching. He's teaching against us, the religious leaders of the day. He's teaching against the law, and he's teaching against the temple. Now, one of these we can rule out right away. Is he teaching against the temple while he's inside paying the fee for a Nazirite vow ending? No, that's dumb. Like the last one, it's easily, we can remove that off the table because he's in the temple doing the temple thing anyways. That's why he's there. They're trying to use the Gentile thing as a debunk. It's not a good one. I'm not going to get deep into that today. But let's move on early in the chapter and figure out what's going on here. Acts chapter 20, and we're going to look at verse 20 through 24. So this is kind of the pre-story here. It says, and when they heard it, they being the disciples, they glorified God and said to him, being Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are coming among the Jews of those who have believed." So Paul has arrived back in Jerusalem. He's meeting with the religious leaders of the Christian church, like James and Peter and some of these other guys that are there. And he has just given them the testimony of the work that he's done. Remember, they sent him out. He has now returned. So he's telling them what's happened. And then they go, look, hey, they affirm his ministry. They say, look, this is great what's been going on. Thousands of Jews, many thousands of Jews have come to believe. Believe what? In Yeshua, the gospel. Okay? So there's this great testimony. They are all zealous for the law. Now, is this a correction? No, it is not. You have thousands of believers coming into faith in the Messiah. James simply offers up. They are very zealous for the law. Verse 21, here's the hitch. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, that's code for forsake the Torah or the law, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. They did say that about Stephen. 22, what then is to be done? This is again, James and the other Christian leaders of Jerusalem. They will certainly hear that you have come, the people accusing him. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow, a Nazirite vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. According to what? The Torah and the Nazirite vow. Thus all will know that there is what? Nothing in what that have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance to the law. In other words, the accusation that we just read later on in Acts chapter 21, is it a true accusation or a false accusation? False. James is just saying, look, go do this thing. You're here in Jerusalem. Let everybody know this is how you live. We know you. We don't have these questions. But there are new people coming in who have these questions that are unsure because they've heard something about you. Now, did they hear Paul himself say these things? No, these are rumors. This is conjecture, right? So some people will claim Paul is only teaching Torah observance to the Jewish converts. However, like in Galatians, Paul's audience is mixed, and he never isolates one party with his teaching regarding the law. He never says, only, hey, Jewish brothers, you guys do the Torah. In all of Paul's letters, when he's talking about the Torah, does he ever separate the Jews and the Gentiles? In fact, Paul's entire ministry is what? Breaking down the dividing lines between the Gentiles and Jews and including them all into right practice according to the true gospel and the truth of Scripture. Paul is teaching the exact opposite that many people nowadays try to accuse him of. In fact, Paul emphatically argues against the arbitrary divisions in an attempt to unify the body of Christ, both in their belief in Yeshua and in their daily practices as they disciple in the way of the Messiah. Every letter you read from Paul does the same thing. Okay? So, if we're going to argue that point, you have to provide evidence. If you read Paul, the evidence just simply is not there. Personally, I don't think so. But it is, again, when you read Paul in context with Paul, and you read the letters and read the other ways that he addresses these common arguments, he's frequently explaining these things, and I think we can offer some clarity to that as we continue to study. So, let's look at this next part here. So the second part of verse 11, back to Galatians chapter 5, verse 11. In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. Okay? So Paul's teaching is not that circumcision was wrong or bondage. Paul was teaching that it was not a requirement for salvation. However, he was not teaching the people that they should not obey God's instructions, simply that obedience is a response to salvation or faith in the Messiah, not a requirement for salvation. Okay, so if Paul was teaching against, or if Paul was teaching circumcision for salvation or circumcision for justification, there would be no offense, right? He's like, look, I'm being persecuted for this. The offense is here because I differ in this one area. They want to use circumcision as a gateway to justification. In other words, you have to do this first. In other words, your belief or your faith in Yeshua is not enough. He's saying that's not the case. It is enough. Your faith in Yeshua for justification is enough, but there's a right way of living. There's a race. You were running well, right? Let's not lose track that there's a way to run this race. All right? So then he gets into this, verse 12. I wish those who instead of you would emasculate themselves. I'm going to go deep dive in here, but again, Paul's being sarcastic here. Just saying, look, if you guys are going to go down this road, just go all the way. Like, If you're going to use this asceticism as a means of justifying yourself, just go all the way. Cause yourself the most amount of pain you possibly can and just go with it. Like, if that's what you're going to do to earn your justification, just go all the way, right? That's the point he's making here. Verse 13, you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve others. So, freedom from what, right? This is the question. Many people will say freedom from the law. What's the freedom that Paul is talking about here? Specifically, freedom from captivity or bondage or imprisonment to sin, right? Now, without the law, can I be in bondage to sin? No. Why? Because there's no standard by which to determine I've sinned. Without the law, there is no transgression. Paul says this in one of his other letters. He's not saying that because the law is done away with. He's saying that to remind you we still need the law so that we can see our sin. Without the law, I have no sin because there's no standard by which I'm being judged. Okay, so Paul's point here is you are free from what? The death or the curse by which you find yourself under the law because the law has revealed to you your transgression. Without the law, there's no revelation of that transgression, therefore I do not need freedom. Paul's making the point you do need freedom. You've been called to freedom, and it has this greater purpose, right? Freedom from man-made traditions, freedom from this self-justification that you will never be successful at, freedom from the bondage of sin. These are all things that apply based on Paul's letter, right? He goes on to say, this is not an opportunity for your flesh. This is really important. So returning to the true gospel, Paul encourages these believers not to use their freedom, this freedom from sin, to run amok in their flesh. In other words, you've been freed from the bondage of sin. Do not return back to sin. Right? Okay? When Paul uses this terminology of the flesh, that's what he's talking about, right? This urge to sin. Once again, Paul attempts to put the Torah in its proper order in the life of the believer. Faith first, then obedience. Right? Freedom first, then obedience. We see this in the Exodus story. Right? God freed them, and then he did what? Gave them the Torah. Right? To teach them how to walk in freedom. This is exactly what Paul is reminding them of here. So, faith first, then obedience. If this faith annuls the law, then there would be no reason for the Galatian converts to not give opportunity to their flesh as a result of their freedom. In other words, no law. Why not give in to my flesh? Because nothing I'm doing from here on out is wrong. Right? If the law's been annulled, what's to telling me my flesh is leading me the wrong way? There's no roadmap, no guide, no signs, nothing. Right? So remember, the flesh represents sinful practice, while walking by the Spirit connects to living according to godly wisdom and instruction. So we have these two dichotomies. We talked about this early on, that Paul is constantly dealing with this flesh-spirit kind of relationship. He gets really heavy into that in this chapter that we're working on now. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, Galatians 5:14. Jason's like, no, get done. I'm just kidding. Galatians 5:14. Let's start here. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Is this Paul's line? No, it's Yeshua's line, right? He says this. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. The whole law is love, echoing again the teaching of Yeshua. Be careful of destroying each other, not in keeping with God's instruction. Remember, God's Torah didn't tell them to destroy each other, did it? No, it told them to love their neighbor. It told them how to love their neighbor. It told them to prefer the other above themselves. It told them to take care of the widow, the needy, and the poor in their midst. There wasn't supposed to be division amongst them, separating them. There was supposed to be unity in purpose and in practice and in faith. This is what Paul's trying to bring them back to. Now remember, this is Israel, right? They all started from the same point. Was Israel only the sons of Jacob when they were in the wilderness and they got the Torah and they made the covenant with God? No, it was a mixed multitude. You had Egyptians in there, you had Israel in there, and you had probably some other groups that were residing in Israel that watched all this happen, or in Egypt that watched all this happen, right? It was a mixed multitude that arrived at the base of the mountain that made a covenant with God at that point. Now here, Paul's trying to bring everybody back in again. Jew, Gentile, we are one body. We have one instruction. Jason was talking about this earlier today. One instruction for both. One God, one instruction. Let's live in unity. Now, what's causing the division in this church? This is why I think it's on topic. People think Paul's wandered off topic. What is the division in this body? False teaching, false gospel. These false brothers who have come in and now are wrenching a divide in this group, right? And Paul's trying to remind them, look, this is who we are. The law is fulfilled in one word. Again, if the law has been done away with, that sentence makes no sense, right? So, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, the law instructs us to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is true. That's in Leviticus. So don't act this way. Don't bite at each other. Don't devour one another. Watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Do not destroy each other. That message is relevant for everybody today, then, probably be in perpetuity because we're humans and we struggle, right, in this area. This is the work of the enemy. It is not a work of God. Paul knows this well. As the fruit of his previous life as a Pharisaical Jew produced this exact fruit in his life as well. Remember earlier in Galatians chapter 2, he's talking about his testimony. His entire mindset before his conversion was to destroy, with any violence necessary, the Christian church. That's where Paul's coming from. And so more than ever, I think Paul is seeing this division and is breaking his heart. Because he was fully committed to this division before. And he sees that this is the fruit of the enemy. It's not the fruit of God and what he's asking them to do. Right? So rather than loving his neighbor in Paul's former life, he sought to destroy them. And this is what he's witnessing in the church now. So verses 16, 17, Galatians 5, 16, 17 says this, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." Okay? So, walk by the Spirit, do not gratify the flesh. Paul talks about this a lot, okay? So, if you've read Romans, raise your hand if you read Romans. There's going to be some language in this statement right here that should be really familiar to you. Let's look at some examples to see if we can better understand what Paul is trying to say here. Romans 8:13, it says this, "For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live." Is he talking about killing yourself? No, right? The flesh is what? Your sinful nature, which you would rather do rather than obey. He said, put that aside. Live according to what? The Spirit, and you will have life. Let's continue looking at this. Does the Spirit teach us to walk against or contrary to God's instruction? It never will. And let me prove it to you. The promise of the Holy Spirit is this, Ezekiel 36, 25 through 27. This is God speaking before the Holy Spirit has been given after Yeshua's death. As a promise, it says this, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanliness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you." What is the uncleanliness? Disobedience to God's instruction. Transgression, right? This is justification. This is what we're talking about. 26, "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you." For what purpose? "And cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules." This is the promised purpose of the Holy Spirit. This is not a different spirit. This is the same Spirit that Paul's referencing, the same Spirit that Yeshua talked about in the Gospels, the same Spirit that we hear all about through the New Testament. It's the same one. Therefore, its purpose remains the same. Okay? Now, again, does this say that he gives you the Spirit to save you? No. Right? The cleansing came first, verse 25. That was a promise. That's what Paul talks about in Galatians. The promise has come. And then second, what happens? "I will give you a new spirit." And this spirit will do what? Help you walk in my statutes and to be careful to obey my rules. Isn't this exactly what Paul's doing? Trying to put justification and the Torah in their proper place. Okay? I think Paul very intentionally uses this language to make the point that he's trying to make. Okay, let's look at Romans 7:7. "What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not known sin. For I would not have known what it was to covet if the law said, 'You shall not covet.'" So even now, Paul's talking to believers and going, look, I wouldn't even know what sin is if the law hadn't told me what sin was. In other words, if I had no standard for determining my guilt, I wouldn't know I'm guilty. If I don't know I'm guilty, I don't need to be saved from my imprisonment. It's just that simple. Right? Okay? Romans 7:13-14 says this, did that which is good, the law, then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin producing death in me through what was good. Law is good. Sin took advantage of that, is basically what Paul's saying, personifying the actions here. Okay? It was sin producing death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin. In other words, it was shown to me as sin through what was good, the good thing being the law, and through the commandments might become sinful beyond measure. Now here's the deal. If I look at my sin and I go, oh, that's just a little one. Do I feel like I need to be saved? No. Like, we don't need to be rescued from small things. You guys remember Luke Thigpen? He's deadly afraid of mice. Mice are small things. Okay, I can say that because he's not here. He can't defend himself. Okay, right? A lot of people aren't afraid of mice, but many people are. But the vast majority don't need to be rescued from a mouse. But you have a hungry lion coming at you, you might need to be rescued, right? Big problems, big rescue. The point that Paul is making here in Romans is the law reveals to us we have big problems. So big, in fact, you cannot save yourself from this, right? That's the point, that sin will become sinful beyond measure through what? Through the commandment. That's how I knew this. Verse 14, for we know that the law is what? Spiritual, but I am flesh, sold under sin. So when Paul is talking about the spiritual life of the believer, he's talking about the right walk of a spiritual person, which is to know and follow the commands of God in keeping with the promise in Ezekiel. But the flesh instead sells itself to sin, not caring about God's instruction at all. You see the difference here. So Paul explains this relationship between spirit and flesh. He's referencing it here, but he explains it in better detail in Romans 7. This is why I say if we can read all of Paul's letters, it might make more sense. Okay? So you see the point that Paul's trying to make here. He's trying to help them understand this relationship between the two. All right, so the next part here, verse 16 through 17, we're looking at the flesh and the spirit are at war. I apologize for the highlighting here. I forgot to make this slide. So let's look at verse 17. For the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you ought to do or want to do. In other words, the spirit and the flesh do not operate in conjunction. They do not agree. They don't walk side by side helping each other, right? The flesh is at war with the spirit. The Spirit is trying to teach you to keep God's instruction and empower you to do this, not for your justification, but because you have been saved. Because you put faith in God. Because He is your master. You do what He says. Because it's good for you. Remember earlier, Paul says, look, it's good. Torah is good. Okay? They are at war. They are at odds with each other. The flesh keeps you from doing what you should. Paul teaches in Romans that the goal of the flesh stands in direct opposition to God's instruction, His Torah. Romans 8, 6 through 8 says this, for to set the mind on the flesh is death. What produces death? Transgression of the Torah. He's putting the two together, right? But to set the mind on the Spirit is, what is the blessing of keeping God's instruction? Life. What is the goal, the stated mission of the Spirit in Ezekiel? To help us obey God's instruction. This is not about self-justification. This is about not repeating the cycle of sin. Right? And therefore continually putting yourself into subjugation and imprisonment over and over and over again. Okay? You guys understand where he's going? Verse 7, for the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to what? God's law. The flesh, the thing that is producing sin in me, does that because it refuses to do what? Obey God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Why? Because I don't listen to Him. If He's truly my master, if I truly have faith in Him, if He's truly my Lord, like I claim, and He says, don't do this, son, like you were talking about before, don't put your hand on the stove, right? It's for your good. You may want to put your hand on the stove. It may be fun for a second, but trust me, this is not going to go well, right? How many of you guys, when you're growing up, your mom told you, don't go play in the street, right? Don't talk to strangers, right? These are all things that are for your good. Initially, they may seem a little overbearing and obnoxious. But now that we're parents and we're saying all the same thing to our kids, we kind of know why, right? We don't want you to die on the road, right? I don't want you to burn your hand on the stove. I don't want you to get kidnapped by some stranger because he gives you candy and promises you a puppy dog, right? Like, the things are there for a reason. And Paul is trying to kind of make the same point here. God is your master. He is your Lord. He is your Father. If you have faith in him, if you believe him, do what he says. The flesh doesn't want to do this. He does not want a master. He wants to master himself. Therefore, he's in opposition to God. I can't rule myself and submit to God at the same time, can I? Ruling myself will produce sin and death, but submitting to God's good and righteous instruction will lead to life because it is for my good. It doesn't save me, but it keeps me walking or running that race well, right? That Paul was talking about earlier. All right, we're almost done. Okay, verse 18. So Galatians 5:18. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are what? Not under the law. Now, last time we talked about under the law. In general, when Paul references this, under the law is typically talking about being captive to sin, right? Or being under the consequence or the punishment of the legal requirement of the law. If I breach the law, there are consequences for breaching that law. So, we just confirmed that Paul is not teaching against the law. Paul affirms the law as properly understood and applied in the life of the believer through the work of the Holy Spirit. Under the law is Paul's catchphrase for being under judgment as a result of transgressing the law. If we live by the Spirit, who writes the law on our hearts and helps us obey, then we won't be under the condemnation or the judgment for our transgression against God's instruction, because we won't be transgressing his instruction. Now, are any of us perfect? No. This is part of this discipleship, right? The spiritual formation that Reese had been talking about. We grow in faith. We grow in obedience. We grow in understanding. And as we do that, we walk more and more and more according to God's instructions. But the point that Paul is trying to make here is that we are not under that condemnation if we're led by the Spirit. Why? Because now I'm obeying what he tells me to obey. It's not to justify myself. This is after that. This is after the justification. After you are justified, walk according to the Spirit. Be led by the Spirit. Why? Because then you won't run off course. You won't find yourself in conflict with God's instructions, right? In other words, being under the Torah is equated with walking according to the flesh. This opposes the work of the Spirit, which guides you into obedience to God's commands. That's the contrast that he's making here. Okay, so now we get in verses 19 through 21. These are the works of the flesh. Is this an exhaustive list? No. Paul is just trying to give people an understanding, an example of how this might show up in your life. This is self-explanatory. We're not going to go into detail on this, but let me read it. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, all things that Paul's dealing with right now, right? Envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, when I was there, right? That those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. In other words, they have subjected themselves to sin in the flesh, right? They are not sons of God. Next, Galatians 5:22 through 23. Now he gets into the fruit of the Spirit. So if you walk according to the flesh, you will see those types of things pop up in your life. If you walk according to the Spirit, this is what you'll see. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against these things there is no law. Why? Because the Spirit leads you in accordance with God's instruction. Therefore, the fruit of that will never be contrary to God's instructions, right? So I believe this is in keeping with many other familiar verses that we have in the Bible. Yeshua talks about knowing false teachers by their fruit, remember? And the fruit that it produces is death and destruction. Paul used a similar analogy that Yeshua used here in this text. Bad fruit comes out of the flesh. Good fruit comes from the Spirit. If I'm submitting to the Spirit, I produce good, godly fruit. If I'm submitting to my flesh, I produce death, right? Against such things there is no law. This is another affirmation of the Torah. If the Torah was done away with, this statement Paul wrote makes no sense. He wouldn't need this tagline if the law had been done away with. If it had been annulled, against such things there's no law is irrelevant to the reader. He would just list the things, right? So this is more evidence that I don't think that Paul is teaching against Torah. Galatians 5:24, and those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Belonging to Yeshua means the flesh is crucified and dead, no longer your master. If you are subject to an evil king and that evil king dies, yay, right? Rejoice! Exactly. And we have been given the option of a good shepherd in response. Right? Why would we go back to enslaving ourselves to this evil, wicked king again? Okay? All right. So, he's no longer our master. You cannot serve two masters. The flesh is one master. Anything not of God is the flesh. Plain and simple. Okay? This will always lead you to death. This is where that one master goes. Yeshua is the other master. By walking according to his Spirit, then, we keep in step with the Spirit and keep God's instructions. And this leads to life in a very practical sense every day, right? This doesn't mean you will never die. It just means that the life that you live will be godly, it will be righteous. It doesn't mean that you won't suffer. It doesn't mean that everything will be perfect. That's not what it means. It means that you will be right with God. Life. Okay? So, remember, this is a response to putting our faith in Yeshua first, not in an effort to earn our own justification. Right? So, he's putting on contrast here. Faith in Yeshua for your justification, I cannot justify myself. So, the false gospel of self-justification is a work of the flesh which produces death. Paul's war against this false gospel is akin to keeping those believers from turning away from the lordship of Christ. This is his mission here in the letter to the Galatians. He wants them to submit to Yeshua. He wants them to follow his ways. But first, that comes with faith in him, then obedience. Verses 25 through 26 says this, if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep step with the Spirit. The law is spiritual. We have the promise in Ezekiel, where the Spirit guides us and leads us according to God's instruction. If we live by the Spirit, let's keep up with the Spirit. Let's keep in step with what the Spirit's telling us to do, right? That doesn't mean all of us will always agree 100% of the time on how this works. But if we're in the Word, if we are submitting ourselves to the Spirit of God, we will be led in truth. We will not wander or err in our way. As we continue to mature, those things will become evident to us as we go. Verse 26, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Again, I think this goes back to exactly what he's dealing with in this church. These separations, these divisions, these men who have come in and arrogantly stirred up this strife and this provocation with this false gospel. Okay? So, here's the end. I appreciate y'all's patience. We are here. Here are some thoughts that I'd like to just lay out as we wrap up here. Once again, I believe when we explore Paul's writing in its entirety in Galatians and in other letters, we can confidently conclude Paul affirms the application of the Torah in the lives of all believers, both Jews and Gentiles. As long as those believers understand the proper position the Torah holds in their life, it is not for your justification, it is for godly living. It is for keeping step with the Spirit. According to Paul, understanding and keeping the Torah is not a gateway to salvation, justification, or redemption. Instead, once a person puts their faith in Yeshua for justification, they are given the Spirit as a helper to teach us God's instructions, to write them on the believer's heart, and to help that believer obey, all in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Paul calls this walking by the Spirit. Furthermore, as faithful followers of our Messiah, we cannot serve two masters. Paul therefore teaches we are to put away our flesh or die to our flesh and our sinful desires, which make war with God's righteous instruction and his lordship over our life, and we often refuse to obey it as a result. In this way, Paul bonds walking with the Spirit with keeping God's instruction and walking according to the flesh as rejecting God's instruction. In combating this false gospel creeping into the churches of Galatia, Paul demonstrates his unwavering support for the proper application in the life of all believers, both Jew and Gentile, not for self-justification, but as right living for those who are running the race of true faith in Yeshua the Messiah. That is the role the Torah fits in our lives. Okay? Exposing and revealing sin, showing us how to walk rightly according to God's instruction. In other words, we do not return to sin or the work of the flesh. We submit instead to our Messiah who redeemed us as our master.
Lead me